I am live. If you've noticed a lack of what would be the word overlays and intros and outros and whatnot, it's because I'm streaming directly to YouTube. Because the other app that I was using is kind of giving me some problems, so I'm sort of test driving, just going straight to YouTube, just seeing how it works. I'll probably try to get things figured out with the other app down the line, but I was kind of getting a little bit frustrated, so I'm taking a break. A little trial separation, see how that works out. Man, it's been I feel like the march to the holidays is going to be a tough one. So I thought I would relax a little bit this afternoon with a little bit of muster. Why not, right? What better reading material to put ourselves at ease than muster? Just a programming note. I have 2 interviews. Hopefully, fingers crossed, they both come through. Tony from Plus One XP will be in tomorrow, and then I'm going to have. Let me look up his name. I'm afraid I'm going to butcherize it. Let's see here. Let me try not to butcherize it. Ithai. Wait, is that an I or an L? I think it's an L or an I. Sorry, Ithai. Apologies in advance. The creator of Hexroll that we looked at yesterday, the Hexroll 2 beta, who was kind enough to hop in the comments yesterday and smarten me up in a few things. I asked him if he'd be around maybe to kind of walk through it, do more of a formal walkthrough. And he was like, oh, yeah, sure. But, and the poor guy is working, I don't say poor, but I mean, he's yeoman effort going on over there. He's over in Ireland, and he's working from 9 p.m. to midnight or his availability, which, whoa, right. But that actually works out pretty well for me because 9 p.m. Dublin Standard Time. Just opening up a window here. Hold on a second. All right. 9 p.m. Dublin Standard Time is 4 p.m. my time, which is 15 minutes from now if you're on the East Coast of the United States. So that'll be Friday. So I got 2 things, trying to finish the week strong. But between now and then, today. And I thought I would get back in because I'm trying to get through muster. So I got to put in some time. So let's just go here. We left off, as I've tried to do it, kind of chapter breaks to make it easy. Easy for whom, you might ask? Well, for me. Hopefully for you. So we are at refereeing fundamentals. D&D rules texts from the start contained an intractable methodological error that experienced gamers know to account for, but that keeps tripping up newcomers. The error is in the way the great constellations of rules are presented as something important. It is imperative for the game that you study these rules and that you apply them perfectly. And if the game is not as fulfilling as it should be, the fault is either in you for not applying the rules correctly or in the rules for not being the perfect rules, capital P, capital R. So better go out and buy some more in the hope of finding that one true game. It is a broken cultural institution. And I think this is, I think there's definitely truth to that. I think there's lots of us find ourselves trying to find the one game that'll hit all the points and be perfect. And probably no game is going to be perfect. Though we keep trying. Some role-playing games do actually operate off a fairly immutable systemic chassis, and those games do usually have fairly good rules. But D&D in the wargaming way explicitly does not. This simulative priority of the game plainly means that where your understanding of the fictional circumstance differs from the rules give way. And this is echoing to that rulings over rules kind of mentality. The fact is that the rules can't account for every situation. So if your situation, as I said, you look at the context around that, what's happening, and you look at the rule that might apply, and you go, wait a minute, that doesn't really make sense. You're really supposed to just say, okay, well, we're going to put the rule aside right now because it doesn't know all the things that we know, and we're going to go with what this fictional situation is telling us. The apt and proper resolution of the scenario has a methodological right of way over whatever might be written in some damn fool rulebook. The great Matt Finch phrased this principle as rulings, not rules. There you go. Meaning that the actual resolution procedure used in real play is not a bare application of a rule written down in a book. Rather, it is the referee's task to consider the simulation as a whole and make an unbiased ruling about the situation at hand. Clever rules and rulings are at the heart of the simulative gaming medium, the elements used to build the interface that the players use to touch the virtual imaginary spaces. In the wargaming way, these interfaces arise from the fiction. The ogre is inhumanly strong, and therefore it gains a bonus to a feat of strength. The referee's task is to lead the group's charge in tackling the immensely complex task of apt and proper simulation. Is not the world a complex and chaotic place? The task is never perfectly performed, but you can be satisfied by doing well under the circumstances and with achieving a consistent simulation that addresses the cogent issues of the scenario. If the game is about the use of cavalry screens to confound enemy scouting, then accomplishing a constellation of rules and rulings that catches the particulars of how that works is enough. I think it's a complicated way of saying that you can be sort of good enough and consistent is enough. You don't have to be perfect. You don't have to nail it every time, but if you can be consistent and perform at a level where everyone's kind of satisfied with how things are going, then you've done your job. To the basics. A D&D referee might wish to take the so-called free kriegsspiel for a world just to get a feel for the underlying fundamental transaction that all wargame rules reach for. I myself found a clear and cogent explanation of how free kriegsspiel works in Engel Matrix Games by Chris Engel, but good entry-level texts for the topic are only ever growing more common. Free kriegsspiel play is essentially exactly like D&D, except you don't start with the fairly complex particular rules frameworks that D&D has. Instead, the only stable rule is the probability estimation rule. A player engages in a maneuver, an action to address the scenario's challenge, and the referee decides how likely the described maneuver is to succeed. This ruling is then enacted with a dice roll, and the consequences adjudicated. So, I mean, not that this is dissimilar from what I read, but it's interesting because it's kind of a little bit of a different angle on stuff, though I guess I haven't read as many intro texts about Free Kriegsspiel as the games that sort of were inspirational. So that's kind of interesting in itself. But I think this is important, and you can do this in D&D. And in fact, I think in the expert set, they mention this specifically in that if you can't settle on an exact, or if the mechanics don't give you an exact in a figure, or a figure that doesn't work. For example, someone says, I want to jump across a 40-foot chasm. And in the spirit of, I want to give them a shot, you say, well, you could try. It's almost impossible. You could try. And you look at the dice you've got and you say, okay, I think there's a 3% chance of success. And you look at your D6 and go, well, if I give them 1 in 6, that's not enough. If I give them 1 in 20, that's still too much. Or I say not enough, too much, right? That 1 in 6 is about 16 point whatever. Yeah, that's too high, way too high. Okay, D20, 5%, too much. But you can always go to a D100 and say, yeah, I can do 3% exactly. 3% chance you got to beat 97, or you got to beat or exceed 90, meet or exceed 97. Go. There you have it. So in this conception of Free Kriegsspiel, you're not even bothering with the other adjudication stuff. You're going straight to that. Let me decide what number you're going to roll, and we're going to do that. And part of your job as a referee is to be knowledgeable enough and trusted enough in the context so that when you say, for whatever the thing is, there's X amount chance of success, everyone can kind of agree with that, which I think was kind of why referees became a thing in wargaming to begin with, at least partly, what, to my understanding anyway, was that they were seen as kind of rules experts and that they could, in the field, say, this much chance, or yes, this works, or no, that doesn't work. So there's definitely kind of a high trust component there as well. For some D&D referees, it may prove illuminating to study how the game plays without the character classes, hit points, experience, rules, and combat rounds, without the constellation that obscures what you are actually doing when playing the game. The conclusion should, I think, be that it is nevertheless the same game, a kind of ultimately stripped primitive D&D. Coming back from free Kriegspiel to D&D, nothing really changes. An adventurer desires to use a rope to haul themselves across a chasm. I wouldn't be surprised with a D&D campaign where the referee flat out decides that this is fairly dangerous, even when performed carefully. So 4 and 6, you don't fall. Let's roll to find out what happens. It'd be fairly primitivist to not query the character's dexterity score, reaching for the foundational underlying conceit of evaluated probability, but not particularly illegitimate. A referee with slightly more inclination to actually use the mechanical constellations of D&D will surely use a dexterity check of some sort. Roll a dex score on D20, or get bonus dice to the above D6 check for having a dex bonus or whatever. Maybe even a strength check. If a skill system exists, that will surely play a major part. A campaign with a particularly metaphysical understanding of level or one with a luck stat or saving throws might bring that kind of ineffable heroism into play when faced with mortal peril. This is why you study the rules text, to have those tools at hand when crafting pleasing mechanical constellations for your own campaign, or to pull on when an unexpected situation occurs in play. I just think the big thing here, right, is we're talking about, right, tools in your toolbox. But just the thing is, like, you have to get to a point where everybody agrees. And one of the things that happens, I think, certainly when you get into, I mean, it probably might even start in the first edition, but certainly second, definitely third, and so on, is when players are building their characters to excel at certain things. That's where you get that disconnect between the sort of, okay, I'm going to figure out kind of what the odds are, and this player saying, but I've got all this stuff. When we didn't have any of those systems to call upon, or they were only very primitive, as they say, or simple, then you didn't have that issue. If I'm playing a fighter and I'm playing OD&D and I want to climb something, there's nothing I can look at on my sheet that says climbing equals X. So at that point, it is more or less me as the player and whoever is the GM having this back and forth about, well, how are we going to do this? And I might say, hey, but I'm strong, but I'm clumsy. And the GM may say, oh, I guess it's a wash then. Or, oh, okay, maybe we'll do this and that. But then otherwise we'll come up with that number. Once you start going down feats and skills and everything else, you get more and more locked into what the rules are telling you. Not that you can't break out, but it's definitely becomes more of a, I feel like anyway, there's a responsibility on the GM side to be more consulting with the players on when they're going to break out, because I may have built my whole character to be Climo the Climber. And if I've done that, and that's kind of what the game's telling me I should do, and I do it, then, I would certainly feel a little bit of unfairness if the GM says, no, 3% chance, even though I'm saying, hey, wait a minute, I've got 20 points. I dumped all my stats into climbing. How can you tell me I only have a 3% chance, right? That sort of specter of, you're cheating me or it's unfair, whatever comes into play. But, for the most part with the, old school kind of D&D game, we don't have to worry about that. Rulings, not rules, but still, the rules do not and should not cover all situations. That's been tried, and it doesn't work for a true free maneuver game. Player problem solving will be stifled by the ever-growing stacks of rulebooks, and the mechanical formalisms prove ever more important in comparison to authentic situational problem solving. D&D, too reliant on the rules, becomes a turgid edifice where a spell will always be better than an idea simply because the spell is written down in some rulebook, ready-made to have potent interactions with every other rule, while the idea has nothing except the players on its side. If those players are unwilling or unable to defend their ideas against the rulebook, then the rulebook will win every time. Just a sip of tea for the working man. Black tea. Thus, constrained from trying to answer everything ever with rules, the referee is forced to fall back on rulings, as things should be. Making those rulings can be scary, but the free kriegsspiel procedure is actually entirely sufficient to begin with. You will be a great referee simply by being willing to put down a number. How likely is this maneuver to work? Count it on in percentage units or faces of a die. You surely have some idea. Is it 20%? Is it 20% likely? 80%? Something in between? You see, the process of the game doesn't require you to be correct in some eternal sense. It just requires you to make a call and move on. The unitary moment of dicing resolution reflects a unique event in the fiction of the game. It may carry procedural weight later in the campaign, but it doesn't have to. You have time to consider later and improve as you go. I think that's a big thing. The whole, if there's a benefit on rulings, it's that until you decide to codify them as rules, then it really is just to get you past a certain situation. We got something, we need adjudication, we don't have a ready-made number. So as the referee, I'm going to decide that number. And I'm happy to talk to players about it myself. Hey, does this sound about right to you? What are you trying to do? You're going to climb this wall, okay, but it's slick, it's wet, and it's night. Doesn't sound that great, right? Okay, well, then we'll give you this number, and then sound good, okay, and then that also gives them a chance to back away and say, "Whoa, that doesn't look too good. I don't like the odds on that one, so I'll go, do something else." But I don't have to be right for all time. It doesn't have to be a decision that will go down and written down in stone and carved in that people will be checking out decades in the future. Going to come back and say, "Todd, why did you rule 35% chance on this roll on this Tuesday in this particular session of this particular dungeon?" Nobody's going to remember, really. So you figure it out, and if you're wrong or it's unsatisfying, then come back, fix it, keep going. You can do it. And this is something as a new GM I think is part of the scariness, right? That I got to do something I got to make this kind of thing, and people are looking at me, and it's all happening. But if you, so I also agree. I think they said it a little bit further back in that, you can do it. You can do it. It can be scary, but it can be done. And if you don't take it as that this somehow is locking you down for eternity, then you just look at everything as kind of a work in progress. The game is a work in progress. Some nuts and bolts. What the referee actually does when simulating in these games is fairly intricate and unfortunately glossed over by most game techs. I'll just take a couple of practical stabs here to give a sense of the shape of the matter. Firstly, learn to perform atomic event resolution as discussed above. A useful little formalization I like to use is to use the rough categories of likely and unlikely events, with the former having a 50% chance of occurring and the latter a 15% chance. Considering most atomic events, whether at tasks or random occurrences, you could probably decide whether it's more of a likely or unlikely one. You'd flip the unlikely odds to get most likely at 5 and 6, of course. Secondly, learn to atomize complicated event simulations. You might not have a clue as to how likely a complex event overall is, but if you can break it down into a causal sequence of necessary preconditions that themselves are simpler to evaluate, you can muddle through. I found making a list of challenges a useful approach in this regard. Make a list of the difficulties and concerns that come up in a more complex sequence, and then just address them one by one with the group, figuring out how much of a problem that aspect is, what the players can do to address it, and whether dice rolls are needed. That this is, in fact, simply what playing the game is, processing the simulation. And there's an example here, but yeah, I think that's a really good point, right? You have something super complicated, break it down into its component parts. If you keep breaking it down, you probably will get to something simple that's a single step or a single decision or a single moment, and then you can figure out that one, and then you can move on to the next one. And if that one doesn't work, can you go on? Can you continue? How does that react? How does that add or subtract to what you're trying to do next? So on and so forth. It is a lot better to do that, and it becomes, and that's like they say, it's pretty much what the game is, than trying to tackle a whole complicated situation and boil it down to one thing. Now, the one flip side of that is, and they kind of hint it a little bit with whether a step requires the dice, because the more you ask the players to roll dice, the more likely they're going to fail. Now, if they may succeed, they may get a critical success, but especially in a complicated, say, task that's going to have multiple steps, they're going to need successes all the way through. So if you keep having them roll over time, the success is sure going to move along, but they're going to hit that failure point. So just be aware, if you can get to a point where you can get to a granular, as they say, atomic component, and you can resolve it. If the players have done enough fictional positioning where you can resolve it without rolling the die, consider giving it to them, especially if there's going to be a lot of other steps. Because just rolling that die, it's just like the likelihood that one of those is going to come up a fail or a critical fail if you're using criticals that can deep six the entire process. You want to make it so that if you're going to have that you're not stacking the deck against the party. This is why I'm not a big fan of if someone says, oh, you got to climb this thing, roll, you got to make 4 climb checks. Well, I have to succeed on all 4. And if I fail one of the 4, I fail. Chances are chances at least are increasing that I'm going to roll something poorly. And on a D20, since you have that 5% flat chance of rolling a 1, regardless of my skill levels, you're going to have me roll 4 times, then my chances of rolling a 1 goes from 5% up. I don't even know what it is, but it goes up. So something to be aware of when you're breaking down tasks. Okay, for example, when you need to resolve an expedition's desert crossing, figure out if it's possible and safe. It would be possible to do a quick 1-roll atomic rough probability likely unlikely procedure, or you might choose to finesse out necessary preconditions such as knowledge of the route, sufficient water storage, and the rare yet devastating possibility of a storm in the desert, resolving all these and more one by one to paint a more detailed picture of what goes into the event. Or you can draw on the more elaborate, hard-won mechanical heritage you have at your fingertips. There are rules constellations for everything out there, and you have your own. You have your own. D&D is at the end point of the free kriegsspiel journey, not the beginning. Yet still, I end up doing primitive rulings and atomic probability checks every time we play. I think most folks do, because you're just always going to have that thing that comes up, and you're just going to say, I don't know, there's probably not a rule for this thing you're asking. I just dropped my glasses here. Probably not a rule for the thing you're asking or whatever it is. So we're just going to go, you know what? Give me a 3 and 6, even odds, high, low, whatever it is. Or 1 and 6. That's kind of a weird, somebody say that's a weird question you're asking me. So I'll give you a 1 and 6 chance. Or that doesn't really seem to fit. You're in a bar and you're asking me if they're going to have, I don't know, like there's something in there, but I'd say, it probably doesn't really belong in a bar, but there's a chance. So I'll say 1 and 6. That's kind of the same thing. So I feel pretty comfortable saying probably everybody does that. Even people who may not be aware of it probably do that. The game operates on common law. The wargaming ethos plays out towards the concept of rules such that quote unquote rules are not actually authoritative over the game directly. They are merely relevant precedent that the referee is obligated to consider when making rulings. If you claim that the campaign is running off the AD&D rules, say the obligation is on you to actually use those rules case by case, insofar as your own campaign process has not produced a new precedent, or house rules as it is commonly called. But considering the rules text as a compelling precedent is not the same thing as considering them an authority, not even close. Rulings are produced by referees in a process very similar to how the judicial theory of common law produces law. We have a selection of rules texts, possibly arranged in an understood order of precedence. We have a history of prior rulings precedent. We have players facile in this corpus of law, and that all enables the referee to produce unbiased rulings based on the fundamental values that they are trying to uphold. Something like this: respect the players, respect the challenge, respect the simulation, respect the precedent. It's actually spooky how good D&D refereeing seems to align with judicial theory, particularly common law, in so many things. You can just apply ideas like, say, the bright line test. A good rule is easy to apply to the facts, or balancing of principles. Sometimes the ref has to account for multiple contradictory values when making the call, finding the best compromise. Directly to the game. I'm not even a lawyer, and I still see it. All right, so I like the idea of looking at it as precedent. Like the rules give you a baseline. Oh, I've got the AD&D DMG there. It gives me a baseline how to do anything. And if I need to look and I want to know, I want to look at what that precedent is, I can look. But that precedent doesn't necessarily have authority over my game. It's that thing I can fall back on. If I need one, I can also use it to build off and say, well, what they did was great in AD&D, but my game's working a little bit different, or maybe those numbers don't make sense in the context or whatever. So I'm going to do this other thing instead. And maybe I'll be building on what AD&D did, or maybe I'll decide to do something else. And then that new decision takes precedence over what was in the rule book. But that you have that, at least sometimes, right? Sometimes you just got to make up your own precedent. Rules cruft. Where all this rulings business leaves the actual established, stable, written down rules is something that I like to call rules cruft, to distinguish from games that have real rules. D&D also has real rules in the sense of actually immutable structures of the game, but the rules texts aren't really about this methodology of the game. It's only dealt with in passing. Perhaps consider this book as a modest effort at directly discussing the underlying principles of the game. But rules cruft, that's still a thing that exists, and a thing that is useful. The cruft is produced by game designer armchair theorizing, and is real play byproduct when ideas occurring in play are written down afterwards. It is rulings precedent from the past, suggesting its solutions to the future. The game does have a place for it, for all that you could instead go all streamlined free kriegsspiel and have the referee operate without mechanical rule formalisms altogether. There's a lot of interesting RPG theory in what benefit mechanical rules are, and how they interplay with the game's methodology and principles of play. But for primer purposes, I'll recommend keeping it simple. Get a rules text you can stand, use it as a source of ideas, change the things that need changing. With time, the concerted practitioner finds their own way and ends up essentially authoring their own rules cruft in unique personal constellation of tools. With even more time, multiple sets, one for each campaign you play. For each campaign has its own topical focus and matters of concern, with different rules appropriate to highlight and help process the eventualities. I think that's very true. And it's one reason why I really appreciate the white box and I appreciate BX, is because they are so simple, but I say kind of stable platforms that's very easy to pull pieces out, add pieces on top, and do that to make your own thing. Whereas something like 5th edition, it's complicated. And, I'm not trying to say that as a ding on 5th edition. Some games really are complicated. That complication means, or complexity, whatever you want to call it, means that any changes you make to the rules are going to have all these knock-on effects that you have to try to consider. But in BX, I can make a simple change. In the white box, I can make a simple change, or just a change, and be pretty assured that I'm going to be able to suss out all those knock-on effects in short order, as opposed to them coming up later on. And that happens all the time. And it's not a real knock on everybody. The internet is great at people churning through rules, finding all these edge cases, and works around that would be really hard to game test enough to find. Procedural oversight. Having another person check your decision-making, particularly when it becomes fanciful and difficult to understand, is traditionally difficult for the culture of play. We are not alone in this. Sports referees and judges of law also succumb to their egoism and struggle against the concept of accountability. It would be so nice to be an ultimate, unlimited God tyrant. So nice. I don't want to assume what the reader thinks about the relative advantages of unbridled power, but I myself believe that a powerful executive office that combines wide powers with a presumption of great wisdom in using those powers benefits in the long term from oversight. Feedback, questions, and challenge keep the institution honest. Player oversight of referee action is traditionally hampered not only by player disempowerment. On there we have a parenthetical. I'll discuss the egalitarian ideal more in the next chapter. It's important, but also by lack of established procedures. I recommend favoring overt mechanical resolution, no secret die rolls, open rules, explain the rules if asked, judicial exegesis, explain your rulings if asked, and explicitly clearing up time to talk about adjudication issues with the group when anybody, even just yourself, thinks that something is unclear. So I just want to stop here because I think this is really important. And I think I guess they're going to talk more about player disempowerment, but this is something I think GMs have created for themselves, the idea of kind of auteur GM. And part of it also comes from, depending on what school of GMing you're in, whether you feel like you're like a chef or an author or something like that, which kind of puts you in a special place, or if you just feel like that kind of ownership of the game. This is my game, so I can do the things that I want, and I don't really need or want the input of the players. And I don't think it's a healthy relationship with the game to have. It is difficult because if you're a referee or a GM, you're going to be putting more work into the game probably than your players are. I mean, I say probably because there's probably some edge case out there. Someone can say, well, in my game, I did a lot more work than GM. Okay, whatever. But I feel like for 99.99%, as close to 100% as I can think about, the GM puts in more work than the players. GM probably puts in more work than all the players combined. So it's easy to leap from that to saying, well, then I should have basically 3 votes to their half votes each or something like that, which essentially puts you in a driver's seat. But like I said, I don't think it's healthy, and it leads to a lot of issues. But one of them is, the players will feel that. I think that comes through, and your players will feel that they don't have any power or authority. And also, they've been trained by years of GMs to kind of taking this kind of authoritarian approach to believing that they have no real authority. And I see it all the time in modern games and old games, or at least discussions about them. People saying, well, it's my table, my rules, yada, yada, yada. And while that's kind of technically true, I think in different situations, if someone were to do that to you at, say, dinner, were to go and pour a bunch of pepper on your meal that you didn't ask for, and when you're like, hey, man, what are you doing? They said, my table, my rules, my dinner, my rules. You'd probably feel that, well, I guess technically it is because I'm at your house and you're invited me for dinner, but at the same time, you're being a jerk and I'm going to leave. But I think there's also an element of, and I guess can be true depending where you are, that there are way more players than there are GMs, and games can be scarce. So players will end up putting up with a lot, including a lot of GMs acting like jerks because they really want to play. But the other parts they mentioned, using overt mechanical resolution, I think is great because, one, it takes the responsibility off of you. If you roll in the open to get a crit, everybody sees that you got a crit. So one, that means you can't really go back, which I think is also good, because if you're in combat and it's that kind of roll and you crit and you want to start monkeying with the die rolls, I know people do it. It's a philosophical thing. I'm not a big fan of it, but I get it. But I think it's good, even if you believe in that, to just go through a phase, try a one shot, try something where you don't, and it's all out there. But the thing is that I think part of it is that when you're rolling behind the screen and you say you got a crit, there can be that player going, did you really? Or are you just trying to kind of jam me up because it's for reasons? But if it's out in the open, nobody's going to do that. But it also means that you're not, it takes some of the heat off of you, I think, because they can't say it's you, or it can't be for reasons. Like, that's what the die did. The die did that. I rolled it, sure, but I didn't use a trick die, so just that's it, and that's what it is. And I think people will see it more, put it more in line with all the dice that everybody's rolling, in that it's not personal, it's not a plot thing, it's not me doing some kind of power trip, it's not me trying to get over on the players. It's just that was the roll. And definitely the stuff on open rules. Yes, explain the rules. Don't hide the rules, and don't obfuscate the rules. And if somebody asks you, tell them. I think they deserve to know what's going on with the rules. And yeah, definitely discuss things that are unclear, or if there's something that didn't seem satisfying, whatever it is, talk about it, right? That kind of open talk with your table about whether it's after a game or before the next game, certainly kind of a session zero sort of setup kind of thing. Talk to your players. Talking. It's wonderful what kind of things we could do when we actually, talk to one another. I've never truly had players perform a deep audit of my adjudication, but I think that should be an available option should I truly escape off the reservation to such an extent as to make that worthwhile. I imagine that the procedure would involve reviewing my scenario notes and rulings reasoning, with the group instructing me on any perceived problems. I have myself realized afterwards that I ruled wrongly in a case resulting in the death of a valued player character. I made plans for compensation and started the next session by convening the players in tribunal to review my decision-making, the error, the reasons for the error, and my suggestion, and I'll come back to this chart in a second, for how to revise the scenario to revive the wronged character in an amusing, fiction-enriching way. It is notable in this context that the referee regularly runs oversight procedures on character players. Whenever you can get players to take on the execution of any game process, whether mapping the dungeon or calculating prices for equipment purchases, that's always a win for active, accomplishing wargaming. Many tasks can be given to the players with the referee in a loose oversight position, ready to step in if problems occur. I see no reason why the same wouldn't hold the other way around. The referee is not above group judgment, and they should always be able to justify their actions, surely. Use your words. Any call that you are ashamed of to justify is a bad call. Overview of D&D refereeing can generally be performed in an after-action review. It doesn't need to stop the game and require players to breach the fog of war as the scenario is ongoing. Yeah, I think those are all good points. And I think if your reason for doing something is reasons, that's a little bit incompatible with this. And I know that for some kinds of games, the more narrative games, where you're trying to maneuver the party to be where they need to be for the plot, you may feel that is something that you need to do. And I'm not going to tell you not to do it, though I would advise against it. But certainly in the kind of gaming that they're talking about here, the emphasis is definitely not on just having kind of nebulous plot or scenario reasons. Well, you guys needed to slip and all fail your saves and fall into this pit because this is where the adventure is, right? That for this kind of gaming, that doesn't really hold what's the phrase? Hold water, I think. Yeah, it doesn't hold water. I mean, it wouldn't hold water for me in a modern campaign either, because I hate that kind of thing where I'm trying like heck to avoid the thing, but the thing that I'm trying to avoid, as I should avoid because it's a giant pit, let's just say, is the thing that the GM has decided we must do for the adventure purposes. So they're going to engineer our failure. I don't know that I would quit a game over it, but I'd probably have words for the GM afterwards. And I mean, I would try to keep it. I think I'm at a space now. I would definitely try to keep it, constructive and say, hey, whatever. But I would probably have words. Okay, so back to the chart here. We have the standard activity model. D&D is structurally traditional wargaming, obscured by the way that Game Master performs dual functions, and all other players play on one side. The arrangement is superficial and easy to break apart from more traditional wargame scenarios. So we have a box here on top for the Game Master, who acts as basically a referee and an op force, right? Referee in that impartially rendering decisions, and op force as in controlling all the NPCs, and of course in opposing. A lot of them are opposing your enemy factions, big bad evil guys, so on and so forth. So for refereeing, they say the referee executes resolution processes and advises players on the rules. So the referee, so here the loop on the referee end is from a referee, you're resolving into the scenario of play, to the brief, where the party is briefed on the scenario and asked questions, into the adventuring party side, which in this case consists of vertical chart. It's at the bottom. The adventuring party has a planning loop that's just a loop inside of the party. It doesn't exit, right? Where they're doing all their figuring out what they're going to do. And then we have all those different roles that has been talked about earlier that you may be familiar from reading in other books, the caller, the mapper, the quartermaster, all that stuff, which then can ask questions and make declarations, which then goes back up into the refereeing side of the chart. So you have this kind of loop from referee to players and back like that. On the op force end of it for the referee, we defined what the opposing forces are. So their text here says the op force manager prepares and maneuvers the scenario, e.g. plays the NPCs. So you've defined the op force that end up in the scenario in play, which merges with that referee loop, comes in, and then get the parties briefed into the party. Questions may go back in terms of questions about the opposing force, and then essentially have that same loop. I think it's a good way to look at it because that really is the overall game loop. I mean, that's kind of it, right? You have the referee who sets the scenario up, and then you're just going around and around with your players. But that's a fine way to break it down. Procedural hygiene. The ref's judicial role is necessarily fairly vulnerable to human bias. That's inherent to the concept of an adept facilitator making pseudo-subjective rulings from often secret precepts. Oversight helps, but what the culture of play has chosen as its major technique is not regular audits. Rather, we strive to build the referee into a great artist of the simulative art. This procedural hygiene is, without doubt, a major virtue of the tradition. Refereeing is not and cannot be structured by rules, but it can be improved by hewing to procedures of play that are inclined to encourage fair and honest refereeing. I like to call procedures that are so inclined hygienic. The implied opposite, unhygienic behaviors are ones that are prone to encourage the referee towards corrupt behaviors. Corrupt. You're corrupt. You can approach hygienic refereeing in many different ways, but here are some basic ideas that I consider particularly noteworthy. Courtesy. A table that practices courtesy towards each other makes for an emotionally safe environment for the referee. Their decision-making is not biased by emotional blackmail. So I think you can take that in many different ways, but the kind of emotional blackmail is interesting because that can also arise in many different ways and take many different forms. But I think we've all seen it when someone will try to plead or roll their own persuasion check versus the GM to try to get something, or try to maneuver someone into feeling a certain way, which would then lead them to make a ruling that they probably wouldn't do if all other things were the same, or if there wasn't an emotionally charged part. And I think that's also what sometimes kind of more the, I don't want to say grognardy, but some of the folks that really rail on the safety tools kind of things, I think when they're talking about, hey, like my game's not your therapy, they're kind of talking about that, because sometimes the reasoning for why things should be the way they are is that, well, players are, it's a cathartic experience, or blah, blah, and like all that stuff can be true, but that's bringing these emotionally charged things in, which we don't, ideally we really don't want, right? We want everybody to be kind of in a nice centered space where they can appreciate the game and play it kind of as it should be played, and not trying to appeal to such things to get advantages either for themselves or for somebody else, right? Hey, that guy had a bad day at work, so why are you critted on him, but he had a bad day at work, so don't you want to kind of reduce it, that kind of thing, right? We just want to be able to play. And once you start bringing that into there, it's a really slippery slope. It makes the GM feel bad if they're doing something, can make different players feel bad. It's a bad scene. Okay, next up, transparency. If you make your random encounter checks in the open, that removes the temptation to cheat in them. If the players can ask you to justify your decisions, that removes the temptation to make biased and difficult to justify decisions in the first place. Right. If you're rolling out in the open, then assuming you're playing with but the thing is, and I've not seen this, but I've heard that some people will play with the rule that, like, hey, the GM can fudge. And I even say, if the GM, you have a table rule where you can fudge something, or maybe the players can throw in a token or an inspiration or something other to do that, having it in the open, it still makes a lot of sense. And that way it's clear to everybody what's happened. I've decided to take back that role, and okay, but I've had to make that choice and everybody sees it. And yeah, for rulings, if you're making all your rulings and players are free to ask, like, well, why did you do that? Then you're either you're gonna have to have good reasoning, which you should have, but it's probably gonna prevent you from doing something just totally goofy because someone may call you to the carpet for it, and you're gonna get caught out. Next up, we have oracular filtering, a habit of combining profuse dice rolls into your simulative decision making helps reduce personal bias in particularly values-sensitive decisions. Would there happen to be a tavern across the street from here? Why not roll for it? Yeah, I think this is one that it's one thing I feel like I should stop saying again. I think a lot of folks use, much of we were talking about earlier in that kind of just rolling sort of free kriegsspiel style, just picking kind of a percent chance of rolling. I do feel like that's something that almost every game I've been in has had. I don't know. I would probably I almost think it would be impossible for me to find a game I've played in where the GM at one point didn't know the answer to something and decided to do some kind of like, well, high, low, even, odd, 3 out of 6, whatever kind of thing. But it is good because, again, I keep saying again, because what that kind of situation does is, one, it makes the players feel like they can affect the world. It's not, well, I didn't think of it as a GM, therefore it cannot exist. And it's not that the players have too much control, saying like, well, whatever I say, the GM just throws in the game. Ha ha ha. But there's that, okay, yeah, this is it's a reasonable request. There could be a tavern here, but I'm going to let chance decide. And then I'm not the bad guy if there doesn't end up being a tavern in there. And I'm not giving way to something if there is a tavern there. We're going to let the dice decide. We'll put some kind of odds on it. 50-50 is usually even sufficient. And just letting the dice decide, right? And that takes everybody, sort of gives them a step of remove. No one's really responsible for it. In a way, I mean, the player is somewhat responsible for asking the question. The GM's a little bit responsible for it in applying the die roll, but ultimately it's the dice. So everyone won't feel complete ownership of it failing or succeeding, which I think is good. Next up, legal reasoning, cultivating an instinctual inclination to consider new cases in light of consistency with prior rulings, with fundamental rights, and with contracted formal rules text is superior to shying away from such verbalized rationalization. I guess ultimately, so what is that called? Judicial or legal reasoning. Yeah, I think finding a way to come in with a procedure to consider new cases, basically using what they talked about in the past couple pages about having precedents, but being flexible to be able to build off those precedents, so on and so forth. And finally, use adventure modules. D&D is absolutely advantaged as a wargame in having a rich tradition of meticulously detailed scenario notes you can just pick up and engage. It is easier for the referee to be unbiased if they have very clear, very detailed notes on the scenario to base their decision-making on. I mean, this is one where I would say, I see where they're coming from. The idea is, if you create a scenario for yourself that has a certain goal, then you are predisposed to wanting the characters, your party, to make it to that goal. I have this cool adventure where they're going to go through this underground sewer, and then in the sewer, there's this purple worm, and the purple worm's guarding this thing, and then behind that thing is this necromancer, and it's going to be awesome. You're just in verbalizing that out. Maybe I didn't do a great job of performing, but I, as the GM in that case, I guess if I separate myself and say, okay, there's GM Todd, now there's adventure writer Todd, and adventure writer Todd desperately wants the party to get into the sewers and through the sewers and to the purple worm and behind the purple worm and to this grand finale that I've got planned with the necromancer. So what am I tempted to do? I'm tempted to do all the things that I say I don't want to do. I don't want to fudge. I want everything to be out in the open. I want all this transparency and clarity. And yes, I want to be completely, as much as I can, be objective, but I can't, because in my brain there are these two halves of me, and sometimes there's that temptation to this time if I roll this, then this is what I'm feeling. Okay, I got to make sure that this goes where that I want them to go, that they take this choice or this other choice. I'm gonna do something, or I want to fudge a die roll to make sure that they get where I want them to go, which I get. But at the same time, I think you can pretty easily avoid that. I think while I could see how it's easier to, all right, I would say this. if it's a third-party adventure module, you pick up something off the rack, Keep on the Borderlands, Sailors on the Starless Sea, Isle of Dread, Against the Giants, whatever kind of thing, Village of Hamlet, whatever. The Lost City, okay? And I read it. I'm probably going to have similar ideas of, oh man, this is so cool. I want them to get to this place, or I want them to get to this thing, or I want them to get to the caldera, or I want them to do this. So granted, it's not mine. So maybe I feel a little bit less ownership, but I feel like I'm also going to be those same tendencies, if they're there, will arise. I also think you can separate yourself enough. And I think for me, the thing that I think about is that because I always think of that this is a living world. So my party goes and they start to do the Keep on the Borderlands, or at least the Caves of Chaos program. I put the Caves of Chaos in my world, in the spot. They find it. They're given very good reasons to go after it, but for reasons, very fun reasons, they turn away from the Caves of Chaos and they go do other things. Well, the Caves of Chaos is still there, and presumably it's still doing chaotic things. So where they're still playing in that world, the Caves of Chaos can still do something. So whatever things I loved in the Caves of Chaos, whether it's in a particular NPC or a particular monster or a particular anything, I can kind of pull out of the woodwork and re-present it to the party. Maybe the chaos cultists, or the cultists of whatever chaos, sure, they're not waiting in the whatever, the temple or whatever they call it, the inner sanctum, whatever it is, I forget the name, ready to do mischief. Now they have taken over a whole land. Maybe they'll take over a little minor kingdom, and they'll be out in the open. They'll be essentially running the keep when the party turns up, whenever they turn up, if they ever turn up. Now they're doing that. So while I may have whatever cool thing I had in the crypt or in the inner sanctum, it's not there, but still these guys are hanging around, they're doing stuff. And I think that for me means that whenever I look at the stuff, I feel okay with, like, okay, I put this dragon there and you didn't kill the dragon. Great, because that dragon now can do all kinds of fun stuff. And it'll be fun to weave back in the world. What is this dragon doing? Well, you guys are off doing this stuff and you knew you had to take care of the dragon, but then you didn't. What is that dragon doing? That's still fun for me. All that said, I think that adventure modules are a great way to kind of learn the basics, how to get going. There's a lot of advantages, I think, to using adventure modules, but I think that you can fairly easily get over the bias part, presuming that you don't get that big head of, I am the author, I'm the auteur, I am the teller of tales. That is where I feel like people end up falling to the dark side. If you can just kind of stay humble and say, you know what, I'm just putting together a scenario that I hope will be good. And if they don't hit that scenario, that's fine. If they do, that's fine. And we'll take it from there. And I haven't put my life, my heart, and my soul into it, then I think you're okay. Unhygienic habits. Contrary examples of unhygienic behaviors also abound. I want to emphasize that doing these things is not wrong in a sense of legal breach. They're just behaviors that I think make it more likely for the referee to fail their position, more like a sin in the theological sense than a crime. So first up is blustering. Macho joking about how the GM is totally trying to kill the adventuring party, or papering over the sadness of a total party kill with self-congratulations and similar behaviors can be fun for everybody, but they can also become a perceived reality on either side of the table and are at the root of the adversarial GMing doctrine that's ultimately theoretically mistaken, even if in a subtle way. Yeah, and not everybody loves that, and you got to be careful, because when I was at Claricon and they had the wall of fallen heroes, I think you can have a lot of fun with putting up those characters and ha ha ha, and it's fun, but some people take those things more seriously or just differently than others, and it can be something that one person looks at and says, hey man, that was just the luck of the dice, right? And someone else might look at it and say, like, that GM was out to get us. They wanted to put six characters on the wall. So yeah, you want to be careful with it. I mean, I think with everything, right, you want to be careful. Just have fun, but probably if you get to the point where someone would consider what you're doing blustering, probably gone a little too far. Excuse me. Next up is outcome planning. A GM who develops scenarios for play by projecting outcomes of maneuvers and planning further on that basis is not necessarily planning to cheat in actual play, but they are designing their content in a way that encourages making sure the outcomes in play really come about the way they're assuming. This can range from pre-balancing hostile encounters to planning scene stack adventures. This is kind of what I was saying before. If I have this kind of what's the word I'm looking for? If I basically have a line that the party has to stay on to get there, and I'm kind of planning ahead, then I'm more likely to push them onto that line or keep them on that line. If they look like they're going to come off, I'm going to want to keep them, on the railroad, so to speak. I want to keep that train on the tracks kind of thing. But whereas if I'm just being open to the scenario developing as it's going to develop, then I'm not worried about that stuff. And then the players have more real freedom because I'm not undermining it or cutting it out or quantum ogreing it or doing whatever kind of tricks. I think I have my bag of tricks in my bag of tricks, I guess. Yeah, I guess to keep them where I want them. And then lastly, tyranny of fun. A referee who believes that the game should be fun instead of correct is ideologically inclined to abandon their role of fairness in favor of service to real or imagined player satisfaction. It would be better to not worry about how fun the game is and just focus on making it true. That's going to be fun or not, depending on the players. You can't and shouldn't control that. I made videos on this before, at least one. But yeah, I agree with that. I think you play the game because it's fun. And the goal for the ref, I said here, they use true, right? The goal for the refs is to run the game kind of the way it should be run. And we assume that will be fun. If we play the game to create fun, then we end up with all that kind of oddities that you run up to. And it isn't just simple. Rule of cool is fine. I don't hate rule of cool, but that itself can be that kind of tyranny of, well, because then you should have made it because it was rule of cool. Like, you should have rule of cool that. Like, I've had people say that. I'm pretty sure I've had comments like that on stuff that I've done. Like, you should have done that because of rule of cool. Like, there's different kinds of cool, and there's different things that can happen from different decisions, and that's just one. Just because you say rule of cool doesn't mean anything, and that's kind of why we have rules. I mean, I go back to the thing that happened over the weekends. If you follow the NFL, there was the Chiefs and the Bills came down to a final play, and the Chiefs made a really amazing play that would have probably won the game for them, but their receiver was offsides, and really offsides. And there was a lot of the arguments. It was fascinating watching a lot of the fallout because the quarterback, Patrick Mahomes, who's usually a pretty calm guy, was just going like he had snapped. But when you listen to the press conferences and things, a lot of what he was talking about, you could have boiled it down to RPG terms of basically the ref should have let us do it because of rule of cool. It was such a cool play, and now it didn't happen because the ref. But you know what? Games have rules. They do. They have things, and we decide these things. And this is why when I made my video on rule of cool, I suggested having some kind of mechanizing it in a way that the player can kind of do a matrixy sort of bending of reality, but that it's tied to a resource expenditure and not to pressure on the GM to allow something because it would be cool. But that's that tyranny of fun. Intuitive decision-making. The crowning achievement of the hygienic mindset is the confident ability of the referee to consult the fiction by perusing the imagined space they maintain to track the game state and establishing gameable concerns directly from therein. While the basic activity of describing the game world for the players is fairly trivial, there are distinctive mindsets that the referee can take to the task. Particularly, consider the distinction between analytical and intuitive establishment. Analytical content enters play via the necessity of reasoning. A room exists in the dungeon because it exists in the scenario notes. A rope exists in the adventurer's backpack because it has been marked down on a character sheet. The people of Italy speak Italian because that's what the sources say. Analytical content is justified by reasoning from precepts. Intuitive content occurs when a player speaks directly from their internal rendition of the fiction, discussing arbitrary scenario details that cannot be justified analytically. Which way does the dungeon door open? Does the goblin know our language? Somewhat arbitrary questions that are best answered intuitively. The referee's tasks in managing scenario content and making rulings about it are performed better if the referee is capable of using their intuitive acuity to complement any analytical methods they use. But this presupposes a generally fairly hygienic mental environment, as otherwise it is distressingly easy for the referee to fall into bias, making calls that lead the game to be more interesting, quote unquote, or challenging, quote unquote, or simply conform to their understanding of what dungeon fantasy should be about. This is arguably the fundamental goal of hygienic practice, to protect and cherish the fragile flower of direct, intuitive knowledge that a player can draw directly from their gestalt understanding of the fictional scenario. The paradox of practicing analytical hygiene to enable the use of the human intuitive faculty. Huzzah! All right. The language gets very, very complex here. So I think we're starting out with, so let me back up a little bit. We're starting with analytical content, right? We look at what the environment is and we decide kind of the things about it because of that. And there are examples, these sort of concrete things. A room exists in the dungeon because we have it on our maps and we have it in our notes, right? We're in the module. There's a room, so there's a room. We're analyzing our scenario information to get to the answer. Okay, so that's one hand. Taking our scenario notes, analyzing them, figuring out this is there, this is not there, whatever, answering whatever the question is. Next, we have intuitive content, which is these questions that we're probably not going to have written down. We might, but we probably don't. Does the goblin know our language? We just had 6 goblins listed. We're playing a game that doesn't list what goblins speak. It doesn't say. So do the goblins speak our language? This kind of goes back to, is there a tavern across the street? And we look at our notes on the city or the village or the town and doesn't say anything. So we've done the analytical part and we're like, I didn't put one in here, or it's not noted. But then that intuitive part, I think, comes in and saying, okay, not for maybe I call it gamist reasons, that like that what they call trying to do something with it. I'm not going to make a decision based on some feel that I want. I'm not trying to make it more interesting. I'm going to spice it up, or I'm not doing it. I'm going to make it a challenge. As long as the goblins don't know our language, because that makes it more challenging or whatever. I'm not going to do that. So we go through those steps that they talked about earlier on a little bit. What are the what's the theme like? Okay, this is a village. It's a smallish village, but it's on a major trade route. So I didn't say there was a tavern here, but it makes sense that there would be a tavern here, but also might be that there isn't. So, we'll make that 3 out of 6, or, roll 10 plus on D20 or whatever we're going to do. And it's not biased because I have no stake. And I think the part about the interesting or challenging bit is when you think of those in your mind and they start to come into play at the game, you're giving yourself an angle. I want there to be a tavern so that I can do something. Now I'm biased. Now I want it to happen. Now I'm trying to make it happen. The other way is just like, I don't know if there's one or not. Let's see. We shall see if the tavern is there, or it's something like, you know what, I didn't put a tavern in there, but it makes total sense there's a tavern there. So yeah, it's there. And why not across the street? There's only one street in this whole place. So sure, this is a 1-horse, 1-street town. Absolutely, it's across the street kind of thing. But I don't have a stake in that. It doesn't matter to me as the GM whether there's a tavern there or not. It might matter to the players a great deal, but it doesn't matter to me. That's not why I'm doing it. I'm doing it because I'm just trying to intuit from what I do know, taking all this knowledge we have of this scenario space and saying, well, the knowledge doesn't give me all the answers, but it gives me this basis from which I can look into that. And then I can use that to say, well, this is what I know about the scenario. And that indicates that maybe the goblin does speak your language, or yeah, makes sense that there's a tavern there. So let's do that. Or let's let the dice decide. Let's figure out what that means. And I think that is a good goal. I mean, I always tried to tell my players and really reiterate over and over again when they'd be, especially when they were kind of trying to figure out what they were going to do, or especially when that, I think really when it looked like they were going to change lanes, when they were looking at it and they're like, oh my gosh, the Caves of Chaos, they've gotten the best of us. We are not equipped. Feel like we're behind the 8 ball. We got to do something else, right? We're not getting it done. And I made sure to tell them, hey, look, if you guys want to ditch the Caves of Chaos because it's just too much and you don't have the resources, you don't feel like you can get the resources, all the reasons you have, do it. I'm fine. Not going to hurt my feelings. I mean, maybe that goes back to what they were saying about adventure modules, but for me, it would have been the same when it was my own space, because I had my own dungeon that I put right next to the town they started in. And when they decide to veer off and do something else, I'm like, that's fine. Don't worry about the dungeon. Now, maybe there's something in the dungeon that you should worry about, and maybe it'll start worrying about you because you've left it down there to do whatever it wants to do. But ultimately, hey, don't worry about it. Don't worry about the caves. Go do your other thing. If this is what you want to do, go do that. And I think that getting into that, and I'm not trying to put myself up with some pinnacle of GMing, but I think that where you can get in that space of, I'm not just, I've got, and I always felt like, and that's also that key, I guess, with if you're going to do a lot of improv in your game, you need to have that knowledge, that what they would call that analytical content. You got to have it, even if it's not all written down. You got to have it somewhere. If you can have it all in your brain and you could do that, then that'll work. If you're going to have a notebooks full, that'll work. If you're going to use off-the-shelf campaign guides and settings and internalize those, or just have them, that will work. But you got to get that analytical content and build that up, at least for the area around you. You don't necessarily need to know the whole universe, but you got to know kind of around what the characters are doing. The more you've got that kind of nailed down, it will make the intuiting part, which I think is really the hardest thing to get the grasp on, especially when, depending on what school your GMing is. And obviously this is assuming you're reading Muster, you're watching me reading Muster, that you're interested, or that this kind of approach to dungeon mastering appeals to you as opposed to other approaches, because there are definitely different approaches, that you can kind of find that sort of freedom that will allow you to look beyond these things that you want. Because oftentimes the most interesting, most challenging kind of stuff has arisen not because I planned something to be challenging or something to be interesting, but that's just what the situation made of it. And the advantage of that is that those things are much more organic, and I find just better. I mean, some of the things that my party got into, or that I've been in as a player, I don't think if my GM, or if I as a GM had planned it out or had tried to set up that way, probably wouldn't have worked. It wouldn't have happened. But the fact that you just kind of lay the pieces on the board and let everyone just kind of interact with them, and then just, use that analytical content when you have it. Use it to just kind of try to intuit things about it, or do that back and forth question answer, and do it kind of with an open mind and without any preconceived notion. You'll get to fascinating places where at the end of the day, once it's over, you'll have the stories that you want. People say, like, I want a great story. You'll get a great story. It may not be the story you were looking for. You'll get some great stories. And then you can get stories that you could never have come up with if you were going to write it down, if you tried to do it as a narrative with this kind of play. Not to say that the other way is bad, because there's great things you can do there too. But in terms of this kind of gaming, I think you can get there. And so it's important to try to figure out, use these tools and think about these kind of philosophical questions, and think about, how can I get to a spot where I have that good analytical grounding foundations that I need, right? Think about, how can I, for yourself, how can I eliminate those desires that start to rise up in mind of, I want them to do this, and I feel myself leaning to kind of put my finger on the scale to get them where I want to go, right? Think about how now maybe I shouldn't do that, right? What can I do? What can I do differently? Or how can I guess, to use their phrase, how can I try to train myself off of the unhygienic principles and get to those hygienic principles? Well, that's all I got, folks. We are now at Creative Virtues 170, page 173. I'm just going to, let me see how many pages we got to go here. We're actually not, are we that far off? Hold on, man. I'm afraid to go to can I view the table of contents? Can I see? Where is it? Show bookmarks? Oh my gosh. We are almost done, folks. And then the appendices. I think we can do it. I'm going to say I think we can do it by Christmas. Wait a minute. That might be too bold. Wait. Christmas is 13. We've got less than 2 weeks till Christmas. 10 days to the 13th. So 12 days till Christmas. Maybe I might push it next week. Got 2 interviews to round out this week. I mentioned at the top. I'll mention it at the end for anybody who's still here. 2 interviews for the next 2 days. Tony from Plus One XP, and then hopefully Ithai. Apologies for name butchery. The person. I'm not sure. The person behind Hex Roll 2 beta will be online with me, hopefully Friday afternoon. to take us through Hex Roll 2. Hopefully they'll be able to. Also, I feel like it'll be good because some of those buttons things we're pressing, and as Dave pointed out yesterday, and check out the stream yesterday if you want to see somebody noodling around in Hex Roll 2. It was hard to tell if things were working, what wasn't working, and kind of how. And I think they'll be able to give us the skinny on what's going on and, their philosophies around it, why they built the tool. It should be a lot of fun. I'm probably going to, I'm not sure. I'm not sure whether I'm going to drive Hex Roll or let them drive Hex Roll, and I can kind of be in the background. Maybe we'll go back and forth. We'll see. Haven't got it figured out yet. That's Friday. And then Tony from Plus One XP publishes lots of indie type stuff. They've got some kind of, don't they have like a zine club? I think they're running. So we'll talk to him tomorrow. I met him at PAX a couple of years ago, and last year at PAX I caught up to him for a quick chat, but this year I didn't catch him, so we're doing it on stream. But I gotta run, folks. Sorry again that this was kind of a last minute dealio. I try to be better, but I feel like from now until the end of the year, I'm gonna be, at least to Christmas, I'm gonna be kind of pressed. So apologies in advance for that. Hope everyone who checked in now or checks in later has a great rest of their day, night, whenever they end up watching or listening to this. Game on, everybody. And I'll talk to you later. Bye now.